Hello, and welcome to Back to the Science. I'm Dr. Susan Oliver, and I'm a scientist. And trying to steal all the attention here is Cindy Oliver, and she's a dog. Now, it seems that quite a few Letby supporters are not happy with Cindy and me making videos about the nurse serial killer, Lucy Letby. So we thought we'd make another one. And this one is going to be about the insulin poisonings. But before we get into it, I would just like to address one point that a lot of people have brought up, which is that I am not a neonatologist. So, how dare I criticize something that a neonatologist has said? Well, it's simple. You don't need to be a neonatologist to do some basic fact checking of the claims being made by a neonatologist. And you certainly don't need any expertise to recognise that a baby died over a week later than the neonatologist thought she did. But anyway, let's get back to the insulin poisonings. Before we get into all the claims being made, I will just go over the basics about how the level of glucose in the bloodstream is controlled. So, this is a glucose molecule here, and it is also sometimes referred to as dextrose or blood sugar. In newborns, normal blood glucose levels typically range from about 3.9 to 8.3 millimoles per litre, but they can go a bit outside that range without it being a cause for concern. In terms of the lower level, below 2.6 millimoles per litre is considered hypoglycemia, which means low blood sugar. So, how does the body keep glucose levels within the normal range? That's essentially the job of the pancreas. If blood glucose levels drop below a certain level, the pancreas produces glucagon, which causes the liver to release glucose into the blood. If blood glucose levels rise above a certain level, the pancreas releases insulin, which causes various cells to take up glucose from the blood. Now, of course, there are various medical conditions that can result in the pancreas producing too much or too little glucagon. And there are various medical conditions that can result in the pancreas producing too much or too little insulin. However, regardless of any medical conditions, there is only one way that your body can produce insulin, and that is by cleaving a molecule known as proinsulin into insulin and c-peptide. And if you hadn't heard of c-peptide before the Lucy Letby case, you are not alone. Either had Lucy Letby, and it was her downfall. You see, the body clears insulin much faster than it clears c-peptide. So although they are made in equal amounts, you can expect the c-peptide to insulin ratio to be between 5 and 10. In the babies that Letby has so far been convicted of poisoning, it was 0 in the case of baby F and 0.24 in the case of baby L. And there is also a third insulin poisoning case known as baby Y that is still being investigated, where the value is in between these numbers. Now, there is a rare condition called Hirata syndrome, also known as insulin autoimmune syndrome, where the c-peptide to insulin ratio can be lower than 1, but none of the babies have this condition, and neither do any of their mothers. However, I thought I would just mention it in case some knucklehead decides to bring it up. So basically, the only explanation for the c-peptide to insulin ratio seen in baby F and L is that they were given exogenous insulin. And exogenous just means from outside of the body. Now, this could, of course, be either intentional or accidental, but the prosecution presented considerable evidence that it was intentional. Now, you may be wondering why there are all these crazy people saying Letby is innocent given this compelling evidence. Well, we're going to look at that next. But first, I need to explain how the insulin levels are measured. So, the first step in the process is to centrifuge the blood in order to separate the blood cells from the plasma. The plasma is then used for the test. The plasma is then analysed by what is known as a sandwich immunoassay. This uses a well that is coated with an antibody to bind the antigen, in this case, insulin. A second antibody is then added, which binds to another part of the insulin. And this means that the insulin is now sandwiched between the two antibodies, hence the name of the test. Another reagent is then added that detects the second antibody. And the quantity of insulin is determined by the strength of the luminescent signal. And this type of assay is used all the time in both science and medicine to detect various proteins. And clinical decisions are made all the time based on the results of these types of assays. A slightly modified version is used for COVID rapid antigen testing, although in this case it is a qualitative test and not a quantitative test. Anyway, there are some well-known issues with these types of tests, and the Letby supporters have discovered these issues. And they are getting very excited about them because they think these issues show that Letby is innocent. But really, they don't. So let's just go through them. The first one's a doozy. They have found a warning in red on the information sheet about the insulin test done by the Royal Liverpool University Hospital. So let's blow it up so we can read it. It says, please note that the insulin assay performed at RLUH is not suitable for the investigation of fractious hypoglycemia. If exogenous insulin administration is suspected as the cause of hypoglycemia, please inform the laboratory so that the sample can be referred externally for analysis. Wow. Now you can see why Letby supporters are getting excited by this statement. It seems to be incontrovertible proof that the test was wrong. But that's actually not the case. Letby supporters just don't understand why the warning is there. The reason for the warning is because the immunoassay can't detect all types of synthetic insulin, which means if someone has been injected with one of the types of insulin that the test can't detect, it will be missed. And this table here shows the various types of insulin on the market and whether or not they are picked up by different tests. The test used in the lab in the Letby case is the Roche test, and the type of insulin that Letby used to poison babies was Act Rapid. And as you can see, it is detected and it's fairly close to 100 at 107. A related claim to this is that the sample should have been sent to the Guildford laboratory to confirm that it was exogenous insulin, and because this wasn't done, we can't know that it was exogenous insulin. But this claim was rejected by Dr. Millen at the trial. Mr. Astbury asked her, just one matter arising, doctor, with regard to Guildford. So I understand it. Would Guildford assist with whether it was exogenous or not? And she replied, no, the results dictate that it's exogenous. And goes on to explain that Guildford can tell you what type of exogenous insulin it is. He further clarifies, so really Guildford would have been deciding or assisting with exactly what type of exogenous insulin. She says, yes. He says, not whether it was exogenous or not. And she says, correct. And this comes from the trial transcript, which was purchased by the owner of the Crime Scene to Courtroom channel and very generously shared with me. And I will be using other transcripts that I got from him later in the video. Another criticism of the insulin immunoassay is that it is not as accurate as a forensic test. This is absolutely true and absolutely irrelevant because even allowing for the known inaccuracy in the test, the insulin results are still massive. Now, the other issue with immunoassays is that some things can interfere with the results. Again, this is all well known, and what I am showing you on screen here comes from the test documentation. So, firstly, a number of substances that are present in serum have been tested up to high concentrations and have been found to have no impact on results. So the next issue is hemolysis. This is when the red blood cells burst and their contents end up in the serum. We know this didn't happen with the samples in the Letby case because they were automatically tested for this before the test was done, as are all samples. And again, this comes from the trial transcripts. And just as an aside, this is one of the first tests that we used to do when we developed new compounds in the lab. And if the test showed hemolysis at base, you knew that you had a dud compound because drugs that destroy blood cells aren't particularly useful. They also talk about issues with high biotin doses, which is not relevant to the Letby cases. And they say there is no high dose hook effect up to 138,900 picomoles per litre, which is good because that's way higher than the levels measured in the Letby case. And they also say there was no interference with 20 commonly used pharmaceuticals, which is also good. Next, we have samples from patients treated with bovine, porcine, or human insulin sometimes contain anti-insulin antibodies, which can affect the test results. Now, baby F did actually have a small amount of insulin shortly after he was born, so it's theoretically possible that he could have had some of these antibodies, but not baby L. The problem is these antibodies actually result in the test measuring less insulin than is there, not more. So this doesn't help Letby at all. And finally, we have, in rare cases, interference due to extremely high titers of antibodies to analyte-specific antibodies, streptavidin or ruthenium can occur. These effects are minimised by suitable test design. Now, to start with, streptavidin or ruthenium antibodies would cause the insulin result to be lower than it should be. So that's not going to help Letby, even if they were present. However, antibodies to analyte-specific antibodies can cause the insulin result to be higher than it should be. And the reason for this is because the antibodies can end up as the meat in the sandwich. So the assay measures them as well as the insulin. So how can you end up with these antibodies that can interfere with the immunoassay? Basically, by handling mice. And that's because the antibodies that interfere are mouse antibodies, because the test uses mouse antibodies. Now, not everyone who handles mice will develop these antibodies, but some people will. And some people will have high levels if they have handled mice recently. Now, you probably don't need me to tell you that newborns on neonatal units don't handle mice. Of course, it's theoretically possible that the baby's mothers handled mice while they were pregnant, had a massive antibody response, and then passed on the IgG antibodies to their babies. But pregnant women are specifically advised not to handle mice. So this is also extremely unlikely. And there's still three other problems. Firstly, in cases where this interference is known to have happened, the measured insulin results were still nowhere near as high as they were in the babies that Letby poisoned. Secondly, as the test information sheet says, these effects are minimised by suitable test design. Now, we know that both Dr. Millen from the Liverpool lab and Dr. Wark from the Guildford lab were confident in the test results and that the lab is an accredited lab. So it's likely that they did use a suitable test design. Thirdly, you still have to explain why the babies had persistent low blood glucose with low c-peptide. Low c-peptide levels show that the babies weren't producing very much of their own insulin. So what was causing the blood glucose levels to stay low, even though the babies were being infused with glucose? Well, Dr. Shoo has come up with a convoluted explanation that he claims explains it all. but actually doesn't because it misses some key facts. Let's go through it.
Let's look at the evidence here. First of all, the hypoglycemia started with sepsis, which often precipitates hypoglycemia, all right, in these babies.
Okay, so Dr. Lee thinks that the hypoglycemia was caused by sepsis. That's a pretty predictable claim because that's what baby F's doctors thought might be the cause at the time. Only problem is baby F didn't actually have sepsis, so that wasn't the cause of the hypoglycemia. That just coincidentally started after Letby connected a new feedback. Anyway, let's see what else Dr. Lee has to say.
And it was prolonged because the IV infiltrated for several hours. We don't know how long. We just know that at 1000 hours, the nurse found that this baby had a swollen groin and thigh and leg. So for some number of hours before that, the baby wasn't getting any dextrose. And that probably explains why the baby was hypoglycemic during this time.
Well, that certainly sounds convincing. The blood glucose was dropping because the baby wasn't getting any dextrose. Two problems. One, when the line was actually removed at 10 a.m., the blood glucose stopped dropping and started to reverse, increasing to 2.4 by noon. Two, when Dr. Lee said the baby wasn't getting any dextrose because the line had tissued, this wasn't strictly true. As he said, there was swelling in the thigh, leg, and groin. This means that although there may have been no dextrose going into the vein, there was clearly still dextrose entering the baby's body and going into the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that's between cells in the body. As I'm sure Dr. Lee knows, the glucose in the interstitial fluid is in equilibrium with the glucose in the blood. So a tissued line would not completely stop glucose getting into the bloodstream. Of course, if insulin was also getting into the interstitial fluid from the tissued infusion, the glucose would then be taken up by the surrounding cells and not make it to the bloodstream.
Instead, what they did was to give repeated doses of 10% glucose. But the problem is that that's actually the wrong treatment. Because the way to treat hypoglycemia is that you give a continuous infusion and then you titrate it to increase the amount required so that the glucose will then come up in the blood and come to the level that you require. When you give repeated bolus doses, which means that you just pump a big dose in at one time of 10% dextrose, it actually worsens the hypoglycemia. Because every time you pump a surge of glucose in, the glucose rises in the blood. There's a surge of glucose. And that triggers a surge of insulin production by the pancreas because that's what it's programmed to do. And that surge of insulin will then force down the glucose. And then you get hypoglycemic again. So you end up with a yo-yo pattern where you see hypoglycemia, you pump in your sugar, it causes a surge of insulin, the blood sugar then drops, you test it again, now it's low again. Then you pump in more glucose, and it just makes it worse and worse. It's a vicious cycle that you keep doing. This is a very basic thing. We teach all our medical students not to do this. All right? This is what was done here.
Now, Dr. Lee is being a bit loose with the truth here. It is definitely true that a bolus of glucose shouldn't be given without giving an IV infusion of glucose. But if a baby has symptomatic hypoglycemia, and baby F definitely did, a bolus of glucose is the treatment recommended in the hypoglycemia guidelines for neonates. And this is in addition to a glucose infusion, which is what baby F was getting. And the reason for this is obvious. As Professor Hindmarsh explained at the trial, the brain is reliant on a constant supply of glucose for function, and it does not store any glucose in reserve to any significant degree. It has some reserves, it can store glucose as glycogen, but that will only last 20 minutes. After that, there is no other energy available for functioning of the brain.
Now, the next thing is that when the infusion was stopped from 1000 to 1200 hours, it was alleged that the blood sugar rose from 1.3 to 2.4. So how can that be if there's no sugar being given? What was not said was that in fact the blood sugar was 1.4 at 11:46 hours. In other words, for that whole period of 2 hours where the glucose was not infusing, the blood sugar was actually not rising. The figure of 2.4 was measured after 1200 hours when the IV had been restarted. So there is no evidence that in fact this baby's sugar was rising because of the IV being stopped.
Okay, to start with, the jury were told about the 11:46 reading. They were provided with a table by Professor Hindmarsh that contained all the readings. And just to remind you, the glucose measurement stopped falling after the line was removed at 1000 hours. They did not immediately increase because the baby had to clear all the insulin first. But glucose levels had started increasing at 1200 hours, which, contrary to the claims by Dr. Lee, was just before the new line was put in. They had then decreased again by 1400 hours or 2 p.m., which Dr. Lee didn't explain. But Dr. Lee does have an explanation for why the glucose went up at 1900 hours, and it sounds pretty damning.
Now, the blood sugar rose after 1900 hours. It was alleged that this was because the IV bag was changed in 1900 hours, and it was changed. But it was not because the bag was changed. It was because in 1900 hours, the dextrose was increased to 15%. So the baby got better, because now you were giving the appropriate amount of sugar to this baby.
So there it is, all neatly tied into a bow. The reason the blood glucose went up at 1900 hours was because the baby was now getting 15% glucose. There's one small problem. Prior to 1900 hours or 7 p.m., the baby was getting the equivalent of 20% glucose, 10% from the glucose infusion and 10% from the TPN bag. Dr. Lee seems not to know that the TPN bag also contained glucose and seems to think that the only glucose was coming from the 10% glucose infusion. As Professor Hindmarsh explained, even without the boluses, the glucose infusion rate was twice the normal daily requirement of a baby. It did not increase when the baby was switched to 15% glucose. Okay, so Dr. Lee hasn't remotely explained why baby F's blood glucose was low until the TPN bag was removed. But now he's going to tackle the low c-peptide anyway.
So what about this problem with the insulin and c-peptide? Because as I explained earlier, the blood test showed high insulin and low c-peptide. And we know that this is something that has been well tested in adults and in older children. The problem is that this has never been tested in preterm infants. And preterm infants are not just little people. Preterm infants are different. They have different physiology and biology compared to adults and older children. They behave differently. And just because we see something that applies and is valid in adults and older children doesn't mean it's valid for preterm infants.
Now, when Dr. Lee says c-peptide has never been tested in preterm infants, this is obviously complete bollocks. It's tested in preterm infants all the time. What does he think doctors do when they have unexplained hypoglycemia in preterm infants? But he is right that preterm infants aren't just little people. And that's why there are pediatric endocrinologists and not just endocrinologists. And of course, that's why the prosecution used Professor Hindmarsh, who's a pediatric endocrinologist, as their expert witness, and not just a plain ordinary endocrinologist. Not implying that endocrinologists are ordinary, they're fantastic specialists, as are all doctor specialties. I guess Dr. Lee must have another pediatric endocrinologist who disagrees with Professor Hindmarsh. Let's find out.
So Professor Geoff Chase, whom you saw a picture of earlier on, is someone who has been studying this his whole life. This is what he does for a living. His whole career he has been studying this.
I'm a bit confused. This is Professor Chase's orchid profile. I will read it out to you. Professor Chase received his mechanical engineering BS from Case Western Reserve University in 1986. His MS and PhD were at Stanford University in 1991 and 1996. He spent 6 years at General Motors and a further 5 years in Silicon Valley, including Xerox, Park, GN, Resound, Hughes Space and Communications, and Infineon Technologies, before coming to the University of Canterbury in 2000. Research interests include control, physiological systems, structural dynamics and vibrations, and modelling. Dr. Chase has over 800 journal and conference papers and 13 patents. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand and IPENS, which is the Institution of Professional Engineers, New Zealand. Dr. Lee has clearly got it wrong. Professor Chase has not been studying this all his career. He hasn't even mentioned it in his biography that he wrote himself. Why Dr. Lee thinks, or anyone else for that matter, thinks that Professor Chase knows more about insulin and c-peptide in preterm infants than a pediatric endocrinologist is beyond me. However, a few of his 800 papers do reference c-peptide, and we will be looking at one of them later.
He reported that preterm infants have different insulin and c-peptide standards than adults. Exogenous insulin is unlikely to be the cause of hypoglycemia for several reasons. First, the c-peptide in this case would have been low for an adult or older children, but it was not low for preterm infants. In fact, the level for this baby would have been at 20 to 45 percentile of all preterm infants. In other words, right in the middle. Average for a preterm infant. It was perfectly normal.
Again, I am confused because baby F's c-peptide level was undetectable. So how Dr. Lee and Professor Chase can say it was an average level is beyond me. Perhaps they are confusing it with baby L's c-peptide level, which was 264 picomoles per litre. So is this an average value? Well, let's have a look at a paper that covers c-peptide measurements in preterm infants. You will note that Professor Chase is one of the co-authors. In this paper, they measured c-peptide levels in 54 samples taken from 41 preterm infants, and 13 samples were taken from babies being treated with insulin, where you would expect c-peptide levels to be low anyway. And yet, the median c-peptide level was 2.3 nanomoles per litre, which is 2,300 picomoles per litre because there's 1,000 picomoles in a nanomole. And the interquartile range, which is the middle 50% of values, is 1,100 to 4,200 picomoles per litre. Remember, baby L's c-peptide was much lower at 264 picomoles per litre, and baby F's c-peptide level was undetectable. Clearly, their c-peptide levels are not average. So Professor Chase's own paper contradicts what he has put in the report. Even more disturbing, Dr. Lee has just parroted Professor Chase's misinformation when he should know from his own clinical experience that the information is false.
Second, if the insulin was really that high, the potassium levels would have been reduced. But in this baby, the potassium levels were normal. So that couldn't have been the case. the glucose level should be lower if exogenous insulin was used.
Regarding the potassium level, the TPN bag that Letby poisoned with insulin contains potassium. So that would replenish the potassium. And as for the claim that the blood glucose would have been lower if baby F was being given exogenous insulin, pediatric endocrinologist Professor Hindmarsh says otherwise. And unlike the so-called expert panel, he accounted for all sources of glucose. Now, Dr. Lee goes on to quote Professor Chase, parroting the various issues with the insulin immunoassay that I covered earlier in the video. So I won't go over them again, but I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the plasma insulin values that Professor Chase used in his paper that we showed earlier came from an immunoassay. So clearly he didn't have a major issue with using immunoassays to measure insulin before he decided to make a name for himself defending a serial killer. And I would just like to draw your attention to one more claim that Professor Chase made in his report. According to Professor Chase, in the exogenous insulin hypothesis, far more insulin would have been required than postulated because it sticks to infusion lines and other things. This phenomenon is well known. Now, Professor Chase is correct that the phenomenon is well known, which begs the question, why did he think that a pediatric endocrinologist like Professor Hindmarsh wouldn't know about it, as Professor Hindmarsh made very clear in his testimony? And from that, we could add on some slight amounts to deal with adhesiveness of insulin to plastic in the infusion bags or in the giving sets. The cannulas, that's going to be about 10 or 15%. Professor Chase has not found something that was missed by a pediatric endocrinologist, and neither have Dr. Lee and whoever in his team supposedly reviewed the medical notes. Those of you who have followed the Letby case for a while may recall the following moment during the first press conference in December.
Personal point of view, that if this had happened to me, I'd be unable to sleep at night.
Dr. Taylor made this comment after falsely accusing a doctor of killing a baby, a claim that even Dr. Lee isn't buying. I would like to ask how any of the so-called expert panel sleep at night. They are trying to free a serial killer with a sloppy report that is riddled with errors, and in the process, they are adding to the distress of the parents of the babies who were killed or harmed by Letby. This is what the mother of baby C, who also happens to be a doctor, had to say. The executive's attempt to halt the inquiry shows their own self-serving intentions and ongoing lack of respect or care for the families. The media PR campaign aimed to garner public sympathy for Letby demonstrates a complete lack of understanding for Letby's crimes and the complexity of the case. The misinformed and inaccurate media circus surrounding this case, our son, and the other babies is potentiating the distress of all of the families involved. There is really no more to say, except if you'd like to look further into the data I presented, I provided links in the video's description. And please remember, this video is about the science, but you shouldn't take it as medical advice. For that, you should speak to your medical practitioner. If you've got this far, thank you for listening. And if you've liked, shared, or commented on the video, double thank you, because that helps the algorithm and means that more people will see the video. And of course, thank you to everyone who has bought me a coffee or little Cindy a treat. You want to, oh dear, just wreck that. Do you want to treat little Cindy? There we go. We really appreciate your support. We will be continuing to make videos about the science in the future. So if you'd like to join the cool kids and stay informed, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you.